conversation series event of the new year. We have our distinguished fellow Matt Stitt and very special guest. I will turn it over to them, but just first, very quick housekeeping. The first part of the session will be a conversation between Matt and David, and then the second part will be Q&A. If you have questions for the Q&A, please send them in the chat to me by direct message, and then during the Q&A, we'll prompt folks to unmute and ask their questions. With your question, please include your name and your affiliation with tonight's event. So if you're a student, an alum, a guest, or community member. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Mindy, and welcome everyone to tonight's session. And it is my pleasure to welcome David Byerman as our guest for tonight's session. And before we kind of get started, I'm just going to introduce David. David is a nationally acclaimed governmental administrator and an authority on legislative process, public management, and parliamentary procedure. His unique career path has spanned executive roles in both the private and public sectors. He has a strong track record for innovation and outside-the-box thinking, and an outstanding reputation with business, nonprofit, and government constituencies. A well-known advocate of participatory democracy and an award-winning governmental administrator, he served previously as the 12th Director of Kentucky's Legislative Research Commission and as the 40th Secretary of the Senate for Nevada. In both roles, he served as Chief Executive of large and multifaceted legislative staffs. As Director of the LRC, Byerman oversaw an agency of nearly 400 permanent employees with an annual budget of over $70 million. As Secretary of the Senate for Nevada, he oversaw an agency of nearly 100 session employees with an annual budget of over $21 million. As a consultant most recently, Byerman has managed a cooperative agreement between CLEAR, a large international association of regulators, and the appraisal subcommittee of the Federal Financial Institutions Examinations Council. The purpose of this partnership is to provide key research, data development, and training services to the appraisal regulatory system. The partnership also plays a key role in supporting the federal response to the issue of alleged bias in residential home appraisals, an urgent and timely public policy issue that prompted White House creation of a presidential commission. In the private sector, Byerman has served in executive roles for several organizations, most notably for MGM Resorts International, a Fortune 300 company, where he served as Director of Communications. In the public sector, Byerman has served on the senior staff for Nevada Governor Bob Miller, as Chief of the Program Development Division for the Nevada Department of Transportation, and as Chief Government Liaison for Nevada for the U.S. Census Bureau, where he led the statewide census effort in 2000 and 2010. David Byerman also earned his BA from the University of Redlands with a double major in political science and history, and graduated with interdisciplinary honors. Apologies. He earned his MGA before it was called the MPA for all of the other Felsians out here at Fels Center of Government at the University of Pennsylvania. And he currently lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife of 30 years. And also his, and they are parents to 2 children, my bad. David, welcome. And thank you for being here. You have clearly a very distinguished career that straddle both the public and private sectors, and we will love to talk about that later in our program. However, to begin, I really wanted to talk about some of the work that you were most previously up to, and some of your research around some of the property appraisal practices, and the work that you did as part of the work with the commission. Do you want to speak about some of the findings in your work and what led you to do the work? What prompted you to take on this study?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. And good evening, everybody. And I'm really happy to be reconnected to the Fels Institute and to Penn. I think back very fondly on my time at Penn and at Fels. So it's really a pleasure to be here today. I've been doing consulting work for a number of years through the Council on Licensure, Enforcement, and Regulation, which is the largest worldwide association of regulators. Both of my roles that you referred to in that probably way too long bio involved regulatory roles because state legislatures are really key for overseeing issues like occupational licensing and administrative regulations. And so, I've been working in collaboration with CLEAR for a number of years. About 3.5 years ago, we initiated a $1.8 million cooperative agreement with the appraisal subcommittee of the FFIEC. And the appraisal subcommittee is the regulatory body that oversees home appraisals. And as you said, the cooperative agreement had really 3 facets to it. We'll spend most of our time today talking about the research component. There was also a data development component, which involved identifying sources of data, but also creating a survey of the appraiser profession. And there was also a training component where we took some of the findings of the research and the data development products and kind of put that into some training that the ASC could then offer to the appraiser regulatory community. So that research component really was inspired by current events, by some major problems that have come up over the last few years that really directly relate to the topics of this racial justice and social equity series that you have here at Fels. Specifically, the issue of perceived bias and actual bias in residential home appraisals. Now, just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, home appraisals are conducted before home sales. This is not like the inspectors that come in and do an inspection of the house. This is more about assessing the value of a home. It is done for the client of an appraisal is the bank. It is not the individual who is buying a home. So there was some questions early on as to whether there was a duty of care that the appraiser was responsible for representing the interests of the home seller. But in these cases, the way we're set up right now, the bank is the client. So the perception and the stories that came out over these last few years was that there was a whole series of very disturbing stories that were coming out about primarily Black home sellers who were getting appraisals on their home, and those appraisals were coming in far less than they expected them to be. And then they had to do something that is just unthinkable. Because they perceived or were concerned that there was a racial component to what was happening, they would, I'm going to use big air quotes here, they would de-Blackify their homes. They would take down African art, take down family photos. Imagine how heart-wrenching that would be if you are trying to sell your home and you think that the value of your home might be diminished because of you, and how awful that is. What a terrible message that sends, just societally. And there were many cases where people would do that process. They would take down family photos. They would take down art. They would have a new appraiser come in. And they would have a Caucasian white, a friend or a neighbor pretend to be the home seller, meet the appraiser at the front door, and they have their home reappraised, and all of a sudden it's worth tens of thousands, maybe $100,000 or more than it was in the first appraisal. There were a number of examples that were well documented over the course of several years, and it became such a prevalent issue that the ASC really started to take a focus on this and started to really pay attention and try to brainstorm how this could, why this was happening and what could be done about it. And it even inspired the Biden White House to create a presidential commission. If you go to, I think it's pave.hud.gov, that is the website for the Presidential Task Force, the Property Assessment and Valuation Equity Task Force, PAVE. The federal government is certainly good at coming up with acronyms, but PAVE was established by the Biden White House to look at this issue. It was co-chaired by 2 very well-respected public servants, Susan Rice, former UN ambassador and chair of the Domestic Policy Council, and Marcia Fudge, the secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and a former congresswoman, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, two leaders that were beyond reproach. And they mustered the forces of a number of different federal agencies to look at this issue. Ultimately, we found some really interesting things in our research. One of the first things that we found and went public with was that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the appraiser profession, you would never guess this, but the appraiser profession is the least diverse profession in the United States, bar none. It is about a 97%, they're about 2%, 2.5% minority appraisers, which is stunning that in this day and age, you would have any profession that is that homogenous. The reasons why that's happening are interesting. There is almost like an apprenticeship process that has to happen when you get into the appraiser profession. You need to put in a number of work hours. And the only way you can accomplish that, because it's unpaid, is if you personally know an appraiser or are, in many cases, related to an appraiser. And so it got so bad that I actually heard a really funny description, tragically funny, of the appraisal profession as being old white men and their fathers. It's like, that's what we're dealing with. And so that really—
To be fair, David, that's a lot of professions still.
Well, probably true, undoubtedly true, but this is literally the least diverse profession. So, it is truly an interesting public policy issue, but the most important, reason that I think it's a very fulfilling project to work on is that, it is really directed at the primary means of building generational wealth. There is no process in our economy where you can, build wealth like home ownership. And if there is an institutional bias that is primarily affecting minority homeowners, that is eating away at value, that is a real crisis that needs to be addressed very quickly. So it has been a really interesting project to work on, and obviously the stakes are quite high.
And no, this is very interesting. And even in some of my work with the city of Philadelphia, city of Philadelphia went through a lot of big reassessment process when I was still working at city council. And it was the assessment, the reassessment for taxable purposes caused a lot of issues just due to the inaccuracies that kind of built up over the years from the lack of regular assessments. And I think during the course of when Philadelphia was going through that, we started to learn a little bit more about just the appraisal community and the workforce. So not completely unfamiliar that it's such a lacks diversity, for lack of a better word.
Well, and the good news here, Matt, is that there are some very honorable public servants that are in this for the right reasons, that are, sincerely concerned. Jim Park, who is the executive director of the ASC, the appraisal subcommittee, he is a former appraiser. Actually, he's a current appraiser, but he doesn't do appraisals, but he is an appraiser himself. And he speaks very persuasively about this topic and says, there is nothing that insults him more or just kind of cuts to down his pride as an appraiser, as the notion that there is bias, that is coming into this process, because the entire reason that people get into this profession is because, they're charged with and they're proud of creating honest and unbiased valuations of properties. And so this really cuts to the quick of the identity of what it means to be an appraiser.
You bring up an interesting point, and I actually have a potentially conundrum, but I'd be interesting to see your answer here. So, when you get an appraisal, right, for sale purposes, or you want to get it as high as possible,
Mhm.
so you can recoup as much, profit as possible from or as much equity as possible, essentially on a sale. Um, but on tax purposes, you hear the opposite. People don't want their appraisals too high, right? Because then they have to pay more taxes. And you heard complaints separately, sometimes from the similar communities, but separate complaints for separate reasons. What are your thoughts on that? Because I have my views, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Sure. I think it's a question of when you're selling your home versus when you are getting assessed for property value for taxes, for tax purposes. So even the individual's interests change, right? When they're trying to sell their home, they want to be able to justify the highest possible purchase price. Keep in mind, usually when appraisals are done, it's after a sale price is agreed to. It's essentially confirming that the sale price is in keeping with the standards of the community. One of the mechanisms for bias here, one of the ways in which we found that this was happening, is the choices that an appraiser makes for what neighborhoods they will compare your property to. So we documented a number of examples, and I should say, when I say we, Clear put together a consortium of experts in this field. It was led by the National Fair Housing Alliance, and they have, a national network of fair housing advocates that they work with. But as they looked at this issue, they came up with a number of examples where appraisers would use, coded language, and in many cases, just outright racist language in their appraisals. And they did this without fear of or without shame. It was just sort of part of some people's approach to their jobs, and that's just wrong. The property should be compared to other comparable properties, not other comparable properties that a appraiser thinks are related by race or ethnicity or sexual orientation. Comparing to only those neighborhoods in which there is a common demographic. And you can imagine that given the historical disparities between different race and ethnicities, between their net worths over time and property values over time, because of redlining, because of bias, because of the long-standing issues that we have struggled with as a country, the notion that people would limit their comps, for appraisal purposes only to some neighborhoods that are similar demographically, almost, it just continues that, it almost doubles down on that kind of bias that has affected the housing market literally for decades, and so I think that all of us as home buyers want to make sure that our home is appraised as high as possible to justify the best possible sale price. But once we buy the home, Matt, we want to make sure that the increases in the value of the property are limited, because we don't want to be dinged for, all sorts of property taxes thereafter.
Yes, no, absolutely. And your research and your even your responses now are just touching on, like you said, historical issues, and as it relates to housing market, particularly between minority communities versus majority communities in America. And I actually have another question, particularly potentially related to your research. Did you notice any differences between different places of the country, and particularly any differences urban, rural, or like I said, northeast versus west coast? Any differences based on geography?
Yeah, I think that some of the most prominent examples came to light in the communities that have the highest property values. Probably the most prominent example was of a property owner in California, in Northern California, a Black family selling their home. The disparity between the appraisal and the reappraisal after they took down family photos and whatnot was literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I don't think this is a red state versus blue state thing. I don't think that it is, it's not an urban versus rural thing in that it's not happening in one place more than another. I think that there are certainly, there are going to be racist behavior everywhere in the country. It is an issue, though, that we did find through our research some real gaps in appraiser availability. One of the problems that occurs is because, there are some places in this country where there is just an underserved population for appraisers. And so you have a tendency to do what are called drive-by appraisals, where you basically don't have the same care taken to conduct a thorough appraisal as you would otherwise. So it's a very complicated issue. There are many facets that kind of combine together to create this environment. But what we found was this is happening across the country.
Did you find any differences as it relates to income classes?
I think that it certainly has a bigger impact. Well, as a percentage, it's the same, but the disparities in the valuation are larger for higher income homes because the percentages translate into a much bigger gap. So the important thing to keep in mind there, though, is that if you're selling a home, in a rural area in this country for $150,000, $200,000, which you couldn't possibly pay that much in like a big city like Philadelphia or New York or in California. But if you're in Paducah, Kentucky, trying to sell a home for $150,000, $200,000, a gap of $10,000, $15,000 between the valuation of the home for a white seller versus a black seller, that has a real impact on those sellers because as a percentage, it's exactly the same issue, and the disparity could impact on minority home sellers just as much in terms of the impact it has on their lives as a wealthy homeowner in California, no matter their race, trying to sell a home and getting a wildly inaccurate valuation.
Yeah, it's just very interesting. Kind of cuts across a lot of different demographics. Um, I have another question. You brought up something interesting in your response as it related to maybe the availability of actual or competent, for lack of a better word, appraisers. Um, that is an issue that we've also heard about locally. It's an industry again that hard to get into. It just doesn't seem like there's a ton of people out there, but it does seem like it's a fairly well paid industry. Any any thoughts on why there isn't more expansion of this industry, especially given how home values are fluctuating everywhere, it seems like right now, and there's lots of cities are going through housing crises, for lack of a better word. Certainly going through affordable and workforce housing issues and challenges, and obviously appraisals are very much a part of all of that. Um, what do you think some of the well, A, David, why do you think the industry isn't larger, period? And then
Mhm.
B, those some of those barriers you spoke about earlier, why do you think they exist and what can governments do or what can we do to, help open those barriers up for more people and different people to get in the industry?
So we looked at this from a variety of different perspectives, but one of the key problems we identified very early on is that there are institutional barriers to entry that disproportionately affect minority applicants who want to become appraisers. So if you have barriers that are preventing people from getting into the profession, then you can't overcome that problem, And so we have done quite a lot of work in our research to identify, what those barriers to entry are and how you can take those down. One of the primary barriers is the fact that this is not, it's just not easy to break into this profession if you're not personally related to somebody in the profession or have somebody who's willing to take you on. because the incentive for the appraiser to take on somebody to train them is non-existent. You still have to do the same amount of work to do an appraisal. And if you have somebody else do it, you still are responsible for their work. So you essentially have to do the work yourself again. So one of the areas that has been explored is the use of technology to simulate appraisals and to give new appraisers the opportunity to participate in a simulated appraisal, so that computer-based, so that they can get experience without having that personal connection to the industry. Another thing that we recommended was just doing outreach to HBCUs, to going out to historically Black colleges and, trying to recruit actively for people to join this profession. It is imperative that the federal government, in this case, actively work, because there have been so many historical barriers to entry, and objectively we measured, the Bureau of Labor Statistics measured this is the least diverse profession in the United States. I think it's incumbent on the federal government in a regulatory capacity to do active things to try to overcome, that environment. And so I think there are things that can be done. But Matt, I did want to point out one thing that is, for the Fels audience, I think many people might actually already be thinking about this. So this challenge, this issue that we've identified, it is literally impossible for certain, to identify when racism is happening and when poor appraisal practice is happening.
Right.
This could be, in some cases, just a question of incompetence, but you can never look into somebody's heart. You can't see, okay, are they behaving in a racist manner? But the pattern is unmistakable. So we know that there are problems writ large. And certainly the appraisal profession hasn't done itself any favors by being poorly overseen by what's called the Appraisal Foundation, which is, it's sort of a bizarre construct where you have a private nonprofit that does a lot of the regulatory work. The appraisal subcommittee, their role is limited by federal law, and a lot of the appraiser regulatory practices are actually vested in this nonprofit. So there are problems with the way, just institutionally, this is set up. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how good the recommendations that we make, no matter how earnest the federal government is in trying to rectify this problem, if you go forward in time, 10, 20, 50 years from now, this will still happen, where you have, a homeowner, they may be minority, that has an appraisal come in that is way below what they think their home is worth. They get it relisted. They might take steps like taking down art or family photos, and they might have a second appraisal that comes in markedly higher. And so one of the public policy and communications challenges that we have had with this is to communicate that there is no magic wand we can wave to remove racism from this practice, from the practice of home appraisals.
Absolutely.
What we can do is set up a better environment so that the appraisal profession is, welcoming of people from all races and ethnicities and walks of life, and B, that the practices are beyond reproach and are as objective and defensible as possible, with secure standards that everybody knows and that everybody abides by.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points, especially as it relates to equity and how things are perceived over time. We talk about conscious and unconscious bias a lot. And sometimes it's not always a conscious bias choice that somebody's just going to appraise the house lower because it might be, for in this example, a Black family that owns it. Sometimes it's just unconscious that it's happening. Sometimes it could be unconsciously that they're just not applying the same duty of care in their job that time, and that is more incompetence, but led by unconscious bias. So, and that can happen when you have an industry that's very homogenous.
That's right.
You
And
bring up a lot of good points. By the way, go ahead. Sorry, David.
well, the fact of the matter is, and I'm gonna admit to my own education in this process too. Implicit bias, if folks out there, I'm guessing anybody participating in this speaker series is probably well versed in the challenges of implicit bias. But no matter how well intentioned you are, no matter how aware you are of the challenges faced by different groups throughout our nation, we all carry around implicit bias, and it is really imperative, I think, for us to recognize that, but also to create a regulatory environment where we can take out the impacts of that implicit bias as much as possible.
Spoken like a true cultural anthropologist. So I know we're at 6:37. Wasn't sure if we had any audience Q&A. Or like I said, David, I do want to speak about your some of the other things you've done in your career as well. But that might be picked up in audience Q&A too. So I just wanted to check in with our moderator.
Yeah, thanks so much. And this is fascinating. And we'd certainly invite folks in our virtual audience to send questions for the Q&A. I feel like they always start rolling in once we begin. I can start us off with one, and you touched on a few of the questions that have come in, but I think you're just very insightful in what folks are thinking. But are there any examples of cities or areas or individuals who you've seen do this work exceptionally well, or any things practices that are worthy of emulating or that make you hopeful?
We've certainly seen some ramifications of our research where different individuals and nonprofits are doing innovative things in different parts of the country to address this issue head on. I'm reminded, for example, of one woman in Mississippi who is running a pilot project funded by the appraisal subcommittee, where she has gone out, she's identified this issue of the fact that you need to kind of know someone within the profession in order to become an appraiser. There are virtually no minority appraisers in Mississippi. So what she did was she basically created a mentoring program where she personally took on working with, I believe, about 20 minority appraiser applicants. She went out and found these people. She literally recruited them. She put them through a series of training courses over the course of a year, and she is personally working with them to help them to overcome these barriers to entry. It is a fascinating approach. It's extremely labor intensive. So, that's problematic. You can't scale that up across the country because, you might look at 20 appraisers in Mississippi being trained this way, and that might make a meaningful impact in Mississippi. But to make that same kind of meaningful impact in Philadelphia, you'd have to recruit hundreds or 1,000 or more. And so it's difficult to scale. But the important thing is, Mindy, we can actually learn lessons from how a project like that might work. What were the recruiting processes that were successful? What were the experiences of these minority appraisers as they were going through this training? And what were their reactions as they came out of the process? Were the outcomes good? So there are definitely some things that are happening across the country that are promising, but as I said earlier, this is a long-term problem. And when the Pay Commission came out with their recommendations, there was a press conference. It was hosted by the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and featured, Ambassador Rice and Secretary Fudge. And one of the things that I heard them say was just basically lowering expectations, saying, we are going to do this work, but it is difficult work that is going to require all of us to take this seriously, to identify that there is a problem, and then to work on long-term solutions that will get us to a point where we can say that we have diversified this profession, but also brought down the barriers to entry that are disproportionately impacting on minority applicants.
Thank you. Great. That's an amazing example and very labor intensive, but really inspiring to hear that's happening. Okay, next question is from Penn community member Pauline Taylor, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. Why doesn't the federal government change laws to better expand the profession and open the profession to people of color?
So it is being looked at. Like many topics, I'm sure in this series, it does in many cases come down to a question of politics. These issues are may have a much in the current political environment, they much have a much easier time getting a hearing and getting legislative solutions put together on one side of Capitol Hill versus the other side. And so there are different approaches that the two parties have taken on this issue. I think the Democrats, the Pay Commission was created by a task force that was primarily comprised of nonpartisan federal agencies, but they were part of a Democratic administration, and so the fact of the matter is that no matter who's in the White House, the other party is always going to be skeptical of the solutions coming out of that party's documents. The federal government, the House and the Senate may have different approaches, but it is a very difficult environment in Washington right now to get anything done. And I'm sure the students at Fels know firsthand that this most recent Congress has been the least productive Congress in the history of the United States in terms of the number of bills that have been approved or even resolutions adopted. So we are no doubt in an environment right now where a legislative solution is extraordinarily difficult, and the best option may be executive actions that can be done through federal agencies. There have been a number of things done by federal agencies to address this issue. If you go to that PAVE website, you can see a list of them. But the heavy lifting, the actual changing of the regulatory environment, those kinds of fixes that are long-term, they're mostly going to require federal legislation, and that's going to require the House and Senate to somehow work together to adopt, legislation to make that happen.
Yeah, quick follow-up really quickly. I know you mentioned the federal government. Do you think there's potentially a role for state or local?
So this is the odd occupational licensing environment in which there are strong federal requirements. The feds essentially require the states to adhere to a number of first principles on how they regulate the appraisal profession. So the states do actually promulgate their own local regulations, but they all have to conform to national federal requirements. That was instituted after some of the regulatory failures of Dodd-Frank going all the way back to the 90s, but also the financial crisis of 2008. There have been a number of steps taken by the federal government to more closely control this environment because this is properly a federal issue, whereas most occupational licensing, for hairdressers, for example, every state has their own standards for hairdressers, but there is a reason why the appraisal regulatory body that is responsible for overseeing the national approach here is housed within the FFIEC. It's because the federal government has a really strong mandate to ensure the financial stability of this country, and the housing sector and the efficient management of the housing sector is really vital to that. So it is primarily the unusual occupational licensing issue that is more federal than state.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, another question, sort of similar theme of roles that different folks can have. Beyond government, is there a role for philanthropy to help address the issue? Thinking about William Penn or other large local or regional or even national funders.
Yeah, I think that there is continued to be, over the course of the last couple of years, really since this issue has become more prominent, there has been a groundswell of interest from private foundations, from nonprofits, from housing advocates. If you follow the National Fair Housing Alliance on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days, they're tweeting about housing equity and appraisal bias almost every day. This is an issue that is really central to the national discourse that is happening right now when it comes to housing equity. So, I think that there are a number of foundations that are doing work similar to what I described happening in Mississippi. In terms of taking on some pilot projects to try to, fix this issue from an outsider's perspective. But really, the primary mover here has to be the federal government through the ASC in terms of changing the regulatory environment, but also the Appraisal Foundation, which plays a disproportionate role in actually setting the standards and the qualifications for the appraisal profession. They have these bodies, they're called the Appraisal Standards Board and the Appraisal Qualifications Board, the ASB and the AQB, that are responsible for promulgating the actual standards and the qualifications for the profession. Foundations can do all the work that they want to, but unless it's actually reflected in the regulatory environment as controlled by the Appraisal Foundation, it's all for naught because you need to fix that fundamental aspect of this part of the equation. So I would certainly encourage people to be activists themselves, to elevate this issue, to talk about it, to shine a spotlight on the examples that have come up, and more importantly, to spread awareness and to make sure that people know and to incorporate it into their communications with their elected officials, both at the city level, as Matt has talked about, in Philadelphia, this has been an issue in City Hall, but also at the federal level with your representatives in Congress. I would like to point out that we do have an excellent resource we'd like to share, and we'll drop a link in the chat here momentarily. But there has been a number of good documentaries about this issue. And there's one in particular that I shared with the organizers of today's event that I think is a great place to start. If you want to learn more about this issue, if you want to share this with other people, share it on your own networks. It's a YouTube video that is basically a 2-hour program at the Brookings Foundation. And it features a documentary that was put together last year called Our America Lowballed. It's about a 45-minute, 1-hour documentary. It actually follows the stories of several minority home sellers as they have tried to sell their homes. Really puts a human face on this problem. And it is prefaced, the YouTube video that I sent is prefaced by some introductory remarks. If memory serves, it's by Secretary Fudge. And then afterwards, there is a panel discussion that features the National Fair Housing Alliance, among other advocates, that talks about the ongoing work that is reflected, the need for which is reflected in that documentary. So follow that link and share that link with your own networks and try to build awareness of this, because that's the only way we're going to get nonprofits and ultimately the federal government to make meaningful change in this regulatory environment.
Thanks so much. I've got a couple more questions. I think we're doing okay with time. The next one is from Tom Hassani, and he is asking, another area that's difficult to break into, where do zoning boards tie into this, if at all?
I'm not sure they do. I think that zoning boards, if you look at like minority representation on all of these civic bodies, whether it's zoning commissions, planning commissions, there really are disparities that have happened historically. I know that a number of organizations have prioritized trying to improve diversity on these bodies. It is literally the only way in a representative democracy that we can have that issue of equity brought to the oversight process is if you have the firsthand perspectives of people from different neighborhoods, different communities. So it's yet another, there's such a long list of reasons why you should participate in our process. I have long been an advocate for participatory democracy. When I drive around in my car every day, my license plate says "Go vote." I love having that license plate. It has inspired a number of excellent conversations with people in parking lots. I actually knew when I lived in Nevada, I knew the teacher that had that license plate in Nevada, and she and I served on a advisory committee together. And as we were leaving, I saw her license plate. I loved it, and I said to her, I said, "Amy, if you ever let that license plate go, I am going to steal it from you because I love your license plate." And so about 3 or 4 years later, we moved here to Kentucky. I went down to our equivalent of the DMV here, got the same license plate, and sent her a photo of it. And I said, "I found a loophole. We can both have this license plate. We just have to be in different states."
That's actually pretty funny.
Great. We have another question from Pauline Taylor. I'm going to see if she wants to go ahead and ask directly. I think she may be a classmate of yours or an alum from another Fels alum. But I'll see if Pauline would like to ask.
I am a Fels alum. Good evening.
Hi, Pauline.
I was wondering if you would suggest that home sellers automatically seek more than one appraisal for their properties and then compare them.
So I think that it really is up to the individual home seller. I think in most cases, the process of getting an appraisal is a relatively routine process. The appraisal doesn't actually govern the sale price of the home. It just essentially validates that the sale price is reasonable from the bank's perspective. So I would certainly be an advocate, Pauline, if you ever feel like you have received an appraisal that is not fair or not accurate. One of the things that has come out of the PAVE Commission's work and something that the nonprofit and advocates have set up themselves are a number of hotlines that you can call to report examples of appraisal bias. I don't have that off the top of my head, but you can easily Google it, just a residential home appraisal hotline, and I'm sure that it'll be very easy to find. But if you ever have a home appraisal that turns out to be markedly different than what you expect or what you think is fair, there are definitely new resources that have come on board just in the last couple of years since we started doing this research work that can address those kinds of issues. But I think most people, when they sell a home, the appraisal is not something they pay a lot of attention to, and unless there's a problem with the appraisal, it's not really worth doing a second appraisal just to compare the results of two of them.
All right, but you did say that the bank was the customer for the appraisal.
That's right. Yeah. So you're essentially validating that because if you're getting a mortgage on a home, then obviously the bank that is lending you the money has the right to take that home back if you don't make your payments. That's how the whole process works. So the appraisal essentially gives the lender assurance that the home is worth what you're selling it for or thereabouts. So the appraisal, the standard of care, one of the questions we raised in our research was, does there need to be more of an advocate for the home seller in this process? But, part of the environment in which we live is that the appraisal is done with the ultimate customer for the appraisal being the bank and not the homeowner. But in most cases, if you sell your home and the appraisal takes place and the appraisal comes in the range of your sale price, then there's no issues and you move forward with the sale. I think it's really when the appraisal comes in and it's markedly less than your sale price, then you are in a situation where a bank may deny you the right to get that mortgage, and then you are personally impacted by that appraisal.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think we probably have time for one more question and then turn it back to Matt to close us out. The last question is about bias. Have there been efforts to crack down on appraisers operating with bias or hold appraisers accountable?
Yes, and there have been some lawsuits that have been filed against some appraisers. And I'm not a legal expert, but I think that is happening sort of on a piecemeal basis across the country. As we said earlier, it is hard to differentiate sometimes incompetence from racism. Certainly, both are happening, and so we can't, always know. But if there is a clear pattern of behavior, or if there are objectionable things that are making it into appraisal reports, then absolutely there are not only judicial aspects to hold people accountable, but also, this is a profession that is regulated by state appraisal boards. And so if you have something happen where you have an appraisal that you believe, race or ethnicity has come into the equation in terms of determining the value of your home, you can file a complaint with your state appraisal board. And those hotlines that I talked about earlier also gives you resources for how to connect to people in your state that might help you walk you through that process. But ultimately, state appraisal boards can, suspend the license of appraisers who are found to have behaved in an objectionable manner, or, ultimately bar them from practicing. And there have been some rather egregious examples that have come to light of people using very objectionable and questionable language in their appraisal reports. And obviously, we would all agree, no matter what your politics, there is no place for that in this process. And so, ultimately, it is most of that actual accountability happens with the state appraisal boards.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'll turn it back over to Matt, but this was fascinating, and I know we could ask you questions all night, I think.
Yeah, this has been a really great conversation, and I think you've touched on a lot of angles. And the one thought that I was just thinking about again about appraisals was now the seller versus the buyer, right? So here we have the issue of appraisals coming in lower, and it's impacting the sellers who are trying to build generational wealth. Back what led to the Great Recession, you had the issue of buyers being targeted for predatory loans.
Right.
And everything in my world sums up to financial literacy and all, and everything that it encompasses as well, so people can be protected when these trends are occurring, and try to get ahead of them, which your research is trying to do. David, I think we did run out of time, but I do, I'm going to say out loud to Colleen and Mindy, I think we should try to have you back in some type of form to talk about your career, outside of just your research, because you've served in a lot of unique roles that I think really represents somewhat of a ideal Fels career, really serving the public, doing it at a high level and in a very unique, nonpartisan level, which is very interesting. Do you have any final thoughts though, before we wrap up tonight?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everybody involved with putting this together. I think one of the themes of my career, whether I was serving as Secretary of the Senate in Nevada or as Director of the Legislature here in Kentucky, I have always tried to make the legislative process more accessible, more understandable, more relevant for people. Because I truly believe that with all of the problems we're having in politics and government these days, the best way to address those kinds of issues, the skepticism that people have about government, the fear that they have that is ginned up by media that is increasingly extremist, the best way to rectify that is for people to be engaged in the process. And I think that, I go back to, a very memorable lecture by Dr. Jim Spady when I was at Fels in the 90s, when he was director of this program. He walked us through this whole example. He brought in people from the street, brought them in. He asked all of us in the class, who is your member of Congress? Who is your Supreme Court? Who are the Supreme Court justices? He gave us all these questions about the way government works. And he brought in these people from the outside and asked them the same questions, and they didn't know who their city councilman was or who their congresswoman was. They didn't really care. They knew about their professions. They cared about their interests. They knew things about biology that nobody in our classroom knew. But the most important thing is Dr. Spady was communicating that all of us who work in government and politics have an obligation to make this process less mysterious for the public and to really connect it to their daily lives. How does what's happening in Washington, or in a state capital in different states across the country, how is that relevant to me? So for all of you Felsians that are out there that are watching this, or all of you that have an interest in government and politics, all I can say is, spend some time trying to distill this very complex process of government into a simpler manner that people can apply to their own lives. That's what I've tried to do in my career. I've had a very fulfilling career working in the legislative world because it's really the sector of government that most directly connects to constituents. And it's a noble profession. It's a noble way to spend your career because it really does, I think, drive at the way that we can make people less antagonistic toward one another, more collaborative, and less fearful of one another, is if we just have more people participating in this process.
I think that's very, very well said. Well, again, David, thank you again for your time tonight, for sharing your research and your experiences throughout the years. I think the Fels audience will benefit. And hopefully we can, like I said, have you back again in some other, there's a lot of other stuff going on at Fels outside of the speaker series. So I'm sure we can find some way to get you either virtually or in person on campus.
Happy to do it anytime. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Thank you, everyone, also, and have a great evening. And I'll pass it back to Mindy. Sorry.
Thanks so much, everyone. And thank you, David. And we'll look forward to hopefully having you back on the Fels stage sometime soon. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night, everybody.